This is also a time of change for my family.
3 minutes ago, the monarchy crossed a line no one inside the palace expected to see crossed so publicly, so suddenly, and so personally. King Charles placed his signature on a private order, giving Catherine direct access to Sandringham's private records. And the silence that followed was not relief. It was shock. Because those records were never just papers. They were memory, power, inheritance, and buried truth. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles did not rush the signature. He sat with the document before him as if the paper itself carried the weight of every conversation he had avoided, every warning he had absorbed, and every family wound he knew this order would reopen. A private order, in plain words, is a formal instruction signed away from public ceremony, used when the monarch wants a decision carried out inside the royal household without turning it into a public announcement. This one gave Catherine official authority to review and oversee Sandringham's private records. The guarded family archive filled with personal letters, estate instructions, sealed household notes, and decisions tied to the late Queen's reign. The pen touched the page. The king signed. Then he set it down slowly, and the quiet around him changed. Catherine received the news with a stillness that fooled almost everyone in the room. She did not gasp. She did not ask for the words to be repeated. But her hands tightened around the edge of the table, and that small movement revealed what her face refused to show. Sandringham, the royal estate known as one of the family's most private homes, had always been more than a place of Christmas walks and old traditions. It held the records of trust, access, memory, and control. Catherine understood at once that Charles had not handed her a ceremonial role. He had handed her a burden that could change how the family saw itself. A senior aide noticed the most dangerous detail before anyone said it aloud. Camilla's name was missing. Not criticized, not accused, simply absent. And inside palace life, absence can roar louder than blame. The queen consort had stood beside Charles through storms, judgment, and years of waiting. Yet this order placed Catherine at the center of Sandringham's most sensitive private history. That omission did not feel accidental. It felt chosen. Catherine looked down at the file handed to her, and the sealed note inside carried a warning of its own. Restricted family review. The phrase meant only selected relatives could see what was contained within, and it pointed toward decisions made before Elizabeth's final Christmas at Sandringham. Charles knew that season still held unanswered questions. Catherine knew William would need to hear this before anyone else did. But before Catherine could even open the first folder, the people most affected by the king's decision began to understand what had just been taken from their hands. This was not simply about access to an archive. It was about trust. It was about who Charles believed could carry the weight of the past without bending it to serve the future. Catherine stood at the center of the decision, but around her were people with everything to lose. William, Camilla, Anne, and the king himself, each watching the same order from a different kind of fear. Catherine understood why Sandringham mattered the moment the sealed file reached her hands. Sandringham is one of the royal family's private estates, a home tied to Christmas traditions, personal decisions, old letters, and quiet instructions passed through generations. Its private records were not just old pages stored behind locked doors. They carried the memory of who was trusted, who was warned, and who was allowed close to the heart of the family. Catherine had been given access to that memory, and that made her role deeply personal. She was no longer standing near history. She was being asked to protect it. William came to her without ceremony, and his concern was sharper than his words. He knew those records could touch the future reign, because anything written inside Sandringham's archive could shape how authority, family tradition, and private duty were understood when his time came. The prince looked at Catherine and asked if she was ready for what she might find. She answered calmly, too calmly. He saw the fear behind her eyes, and that frightened him more than any official warning could. Catherine could handle duty. William knew that. But this was not only duty. This was family truth. Camilla learned of the order from an aide who could barely meet her gaze. She did not raise her voice at first. She simply asked when Charles had signed it, who had been present, and why Catherine had been told before her. The queen consort's expression hardened, as each answer made the silence around her feel more deliberate. She had stood beside the king through years of judgment. Yet this decision had been made without her hand anywhere near it. Camilla felt the insult before she understood the danger. Anne stood apart from the emotional storm, watching with the stillness of someone who recognized a royal warning before others did. The Princess Royal knew Charles did not make private household decisions lightly. A private order, in simple words, is a signed instruction meant to guide the royal household away from public view. If the king had locked a second copy inside his personal cabinet, then he had planned this before the room ever learned of it. Anne understood what that meant. Something had gone wrong long before today. Camilla finally asked who advised Charles, and the answer that came back chilled the room. No name, no courtier, no rival whispering in the dark. Just one sentence. The records themselves forced his hand. Catherine heard it later and went silent. William heard it and drew closer to her. Anne heard it and lowered her eyes. And the moment everyone began looking for the reason behind the order, one old incident returned from the shadows with devastating force. Every royal rupture has a moment people later pretend they did not notice. For this one, it was the Christmas ledger incident at Sandringham, a quiet but explosive confrontation that happened behind closed doors after the family's private holiday gathering. What began as a disagreement over an old household ledger became the trigger Charles never forgot, and Catherine never fully understood until now. Catherine remembered the tension before she understood the danger. The household ledger, in simple words, was a private record book used to track guest access, estate instructions, room permissions, and family decisions inside Sandringham. It was not meant to leave its usual storage without a proper family witness. Yet during that Christmas gathering, the restricted ledger had been moved before a private review could take place. That single act made everything feel different. Sandringham was not only a family home, it was where old promises were kept, where Elizabeth's final wishes still carried quiet power, and where one missing record could change the meaning of an entire tradition. Catherine saw the elderly household steward after the discovery, and his face told her more than his words did. He stood near the doorway, shaken, unable to hide that something sacred had been disturbed. The steward explained through a documented household account that the ledger had always required strict handling, especially because it contained handwritten notes linked to Elizabeth's final years at Sandringham. Catherine listened carefully, but she did not yet know why the man looked so afraid. She only knew that his fear was real, and that it had landed in the room like a warning no one wanted to repeat. Charles questioned Camilla later in private, and the conversation never rose into shouting. That made it worse. The king kept his voice controlled, but disappointment sat beneath every word. He asked what she knew, when she had heard the ledger was moved, and why certain household instructions now seemed different from what had once been written. Camilla defended herself with sharp restraint, insisting she had not crossed the boundary he feared. But Charles did not look relieved. He looked wounded, and the queen consort saw that his doubt had already entered the room before she did. Anne remembered another detail, and that memory made the incident impossible to dismiss. The Princess Royal had seen a notation in the ledger that did not match a later household instruction, a small conflict that made the missing hours around the document feel dangerous. Anne did not reveal it publicly. She shared it through a private family conversation recorded later in a confidential palace note. That made the warning harder to ignore. Someone had not merely touched a record. Someone may have touched the meaning behind it. William was never told the full story, but he felt its shadow through Catherine. The prince noticed how quiet she became after returning from Sandringham, how carefully she chose her words, how often she paused before speaking of Charles. Catherine did not accuse anyone. She did not break confidence. But William knew his wife well enough to understand when duty had frightened her. The Christmas ledger incident became the silent point of no return. Charles carried it. Catherine absorbed it. Camilla felt its suspicion. Anne remembered its contradiction. William sensed its pull. And once the king signed the private order giving Catherine authority over Sandringham's records, everyone knew the old wound was opening again. That buried Christmas moment did not remain buried for long, because the first confrontation came faster than anyone inside the palace expected. The confrontation did not happen before cameras, advisors, or ceremonial witnesses. It happened in a private sitting room, where silence felt sharper than shouting. Camilla entered with the wounded pride of someone who believed she had been publicly diminished in private. Charles waited by the fireplace, already knowing the question she would ask. Catherine's name had become the center of the storm, and no one could soften it. Camilla did not sit at first. She stood across from Charles, and asked why Catherine had been trusted with records she herself had never been invited to oversee. The Queen Consort understood exactly what the order meant. Sandringham's private records were not ordinary household files. They were family papers, holding old letters, estate instructions, access notes, and private decisions that could shape influence inside the royal home. For Camilla, the order felt like a shift in confidence. It told the household who the king trusted to guard the past, and who he did not. Charles let the question hang between them. He knew this could not be softened as routine administration. The timing was too sharp. The secrecy was too deep. Catherine's name on the order made it personal, because she was not just being allowed to read old records. She was being placed above old channels of access. A private order, in simple terms, is a signed royal instruction, carried out away from public ceremony. And this one had moved authority without asking Camilla to approve it. The king understood why she felt wounded, but he also knew why he had signed it. Camilla's voice tightened as she asked whether Anne had known. Charles did not answer quickly enough, and that pause gave her everything. The Princess Royal had been told. William had been told. Catherine had been prepared. The Queen Consort realized the decision had not arrived suddenly in a burst of emotion. It had been built carefully, protected quietly, and kept away from her until it could no longer be stopped. That knowledge struck harder than the order itself. Charles finally spoke, and his words were calm enough to feel brutal. He told Camilla the issue was not status, it was safeguarding. The word landed between them like a quiet accusation. Safeguarding meant protecting something from damage, misuse, or distortion, and Camilla understood the meaning at once. He was not saying she had failed as his wife. He was saying the records had become too sensitive to pass through familiar hands without control. Camilla kept glancing at the sealed folder on the side table. She knew it mattered, because Charles kept it close, and because he did not offer it to her. The folder seemed to hold the part of the story no one wanted spoken aloud. Catherine's authority was no longer a simple act of trust. It was a barrier. It was a warning. It was proof that the old Christmas wound had not healed. Charles looked at Camilla and finally said, "Catherine must see the records before anyone else alters the meaning of them." The Queen Consort went still, not because she had no answer, but because she understood the conflict had moved beyond hurt feelings. This was no longer about respect. It was about control over memory. And the true force behind the king's order was not anger at Camilla. It was a deeper fear about who would control the monarchy's memory. Sandringham's private records were never ordinary files. They were the quiet machinery beneath royal tradition, the place where spoken promises became written instructions, and private wishes survived long after the people who made them were gone. Charles knew that whoever controlled those records controlled more than history. They controlled context, and context, inside a monarchy, can become power. Catherine entered the records room with the weight of the order pressing on her before she touched a single page. The archive, in simple words, was the private collection of letters, room use records, estate instructions, family memoranda, and notes from senior household figures across different reigns. It mattered because these records did not only explain what happened at Sandringham, they explained why certain people were trusted, why certain doors opened, and why certain promises survived, even after the voices that made them were gone. Catherine understood that her new authority had cut through old channels, allowing her to review sensitive files without approval from courtiers tied to older palace factions. The longtime archivist watched her closely, then lowered his eyes with quiet respect. He had served the household long enough to know when a routine visit was not routine at all. Catherine saw the emotion in his face and felt the seriousness of what Charles had placed in her hands. This was not a tour through history. This was a test of judgment. The archivist placed the first file before her and said, through a documented internal account, that some records had not been reviewed by a senior family member since Elizabeth's final years. Catherine did not answer immediately. She simply looked at the file, knowing it might change how she saw people she still had to face across family tables. Catherine paused before opening it. That pause mattered. It showed she understood the danger was not only in what the paper said, but in what it could do once read. The first record referred to a private instruction from Elizabeth about the future stewardship of Sandringham traditions. Stewardship, in plain words, means the duty of protecting something important and passing it forward safely. Catherine read the line twice. The wording did not match what some aides had repeated for months. The difference was small, but inside royal life, small differences can become dangerous truths. Charles had feared this exact moment. The king knew that if old instructions were repeated incorrectly long enough, they could begin to feel official. Catherine now saw why he had acted. A second note suggested that certain household permissions had once been questioned, then quietly restored without the normal level of explanation. That raised a sharper question. Who benefited when authority became blurred? And who wanted those blurred lines to remain? Catherine turned another page and stopped. A handwritten mark sat beside Camilla's household access file. The Queen Consort's name appeared only once, but the mark beside it carried the force of a warning. Catherine did not accuse her. She did not jump to anger, but the discovery changed the room. The archivist noticed her silence and understood that the order had just become more than symbolic. Catherine closed the file carefully, but the damage was already moving. Charles' signature had opened the door. The records had answered back, and once that mark was found, the order stopped being symbolic and became operational, and the consequences began immediately. The first signs of fallout were not dramatic announcements. They were smaller, colder, and far more humiliating. A meeting cancelled without explanation. A file rerouted before arrival. A staff member instructed to wait outside a room once considered familiar. Inside the palace, everyone understood the language of closed doors, and by nightfall, Camilla was hearing it spoken around her with devastating clarity. Catherine's new authority changed the rhythm of the household almost immediately. Every Sandringham-related request now had to pass through her review before approval. And review, in simple words, meant she had the power to examine a request and decide whether it could move forward. That mattered, because Sandringham's records were tied to family memory, old instructions, private access, and the future shape of royal trust. Catherine had not asked for that power, but once Charles gave it to her, the palace had to obey it. The order was no longer just a signature. It had become procedure. William supported the order, even though he knew it would hurt Camilla. The prince saw Catherine's authority as protection for the future reign, because any confusion in the old records could later become a weapon against the family. He believed Charles had acted to stop private history from being bent by old loyalties or quiet influence. But that difference brought no comfort to the Queen Consort. To Camilla, Protection sounded like suspicion, and suspicion, once placed inside a royal household, does not leave quietly. Camilla sent her private secretary to retrieve a Sandringham file she believed should still be available to her office. The secretary returned empty-handed, visibly uncomfortable, and that told her everything before he spoke. He explained that the request had been rerouted for Catherine's review. Rerouted, in plain words, meant the file was no longer moving through the old path. It now had to pass through the woman Camilla felt had been placed above her. The queen consort did not shout. She simply sat down, gripped the arm of her chair, and let humiliation turn slowly into anger. Anne confirmed the deeper reason in a quiet conversation with William. She told the prince, through a private family exchange later preserved in a confidential note, that the restrictions were necessary because too many hands had learned which drawers mattered. The words were simple, but they cut deep. Anne was not speaking about furniture. She was speaking about access, about people knowing exactly where sensitive records lived, which files mattered, and which pieces of history could change the balance inside the family. Catherine discovered the sealed inventory list soon after, and the pressure around her grew colder. An inventory list, in simple words, is a record showing what documents exist, where they are stored, and who has handled or copied them. This one showed that several old references to Elizabeth's private instructions had been copied, but not logged in the usual way. Catherine stared at the entries, realizing that Charles's fear had not been imagined. Something had moved through the system quietly, and someone had wanted it to remain quiet. William saw the strain settling over Catherine and made his choice. He would not let her carry the next revelation alone. Camilla felt the doors closing. Anne knew why they had to close. Charles's order had divided the palace between quiet approval and private resentment, and that decision led to the most human moment of the entire crisis. Not in an office, not before advisors, but between a husband and wife carrying the future together. For the first time since the order was signed, the noise of the palace faded. No aides, no secretaries, no careful witnesses standing at the edge of the room. Just William and Catherine, behind a closed door, facing the truth that trust can feel like a gift and a punishment at the same time. She had been given the records, but he could see what they were taking from her. Catherine sat with the marked inventory entry before her, but she did not open it again right away. Sandringham's private records, in simple words, were the family's guarded papers tied to old letters, estate decisions, access notes, and private instructions. Now Catherine understood they could reshape more than household procedure. They could change how people inside the family trusted one another. They could turn old loyalty into doubt. They could force everyone to ask who had protected the truth and who had quietly benefited from confusion. William watched her carefully, and the worry in him deepened. The prince knew this decision would follow them into the future, because Catherine's judgment was now formally tied to one of the monarchy's most sensitive private estates. If she handled the records too softly, people would say she protected the wrong names. If she handled them too harshly, people would say she used Charles's trust as a weapon. William understood the trap before she set it. Catherine had been given power, but the power came wrapped in pain. Catherine finally looked at him and admitted what she had been holding back. She said she was not afraid of reading the files. She was afraid of recognizing the truth in them. The words landed quietly, but they shook him. William took her hand and told her the king chose her because she could protect what others might use. He did not say it to flatter her. He said it because he believed it. Catherine had spent years learning restraint, and now restraint had become her strongest shield. Catherine showed William the marked inventory entry connected to Elizabeth's private instruction. An inventory entry, in plain words, is a listed record showing a document's location, handling history, and related notes. This entry mattered because it linked the late Queen's private wishes to a later change that did not fully match the original wording. William read it once, then again, and his expression changed. The prince realized Charles may not have been punishing anyone. The king may have been correcting a hidden distortion before it hardened into family truth. William did not ask Catherine to expose Camilla. Catherine did not offer to do it. That moment mattered more than anger ever could. They agreed the records must not become a weapon, even against the queen consort, because the monarchy could not survive if truth was used only for revenge. Catherine would protect the meaning of the papers, not twist them into another palace battle. William saw the cost of that choice, and he respected her more because of it. Catherine chose restraint, but restraint did not stop the storm. By morning, whispers had escaped the walls. Charles's private order was no longer just a family matter. Camilla's exclusion was no longer just an internal wound. Sandringham had become the center of public judgment. What began as a private order behind palace walls now became a public test of trust, loyalty, and the monarchy's fragile image. By morning, the private order was no longer private in feeling, even if the palace refused to release every detail. Britain woke to a single image that captured the national mood. A newspaper front page showing Sandringham's gates beneath the headline, "Catherine given the keys to the past." It was elegant, brutal, and impossible to misread. The country understood one thing immediately: someone had been trusted, and someone had not. Catherine watched the coverage in silence, and the sadness in her face said more than any statement could. The private order, in simple words, was Charles's signed instruction giving her authority over Sandringham's guarded family records. It mattered because those records were tied to old letters, estate decisions, access notes, and private instructions that helped shape royal memory. But now the public saw it as something bigger. They saw Catherine as the guardian of the past. They saw Camilla as the person left outside the locked door. That comparison hurt Catherine because she had never wanted the duty to become a public wound. Camilla saw the same front page and turned it over without speaking. The queen consort could not bear the image of Sandringham's gates printed beside Catherine's name, as if the country had already decided who belonged closest to the family's hidden truth. For her, the headline was not just sharp, it was humiliating. Sandringham was not a cold institution to her. It was a royal home filled with private meaning, and now the public had turned it into a symbol of trust denied. Camilla sat with that pain, and the silence around her became heavier than anger. Broadcasters seized the story with careful voices and loaded pauses. One presenter described the decision as a rare internal move with deep family implications, focusing less on legal procedure and more on Charles's confidence in Catherine. Legal procedure, in plain language, means the formal process behind an official decision. But the public was not interested in paperwork. They were watching the emotional meaning. They understood that the king had not simply moved files. He had moved faith. A crowd gathered outside the Sandringham estate entrance. Not loudly, not violently, but with a strange stillness. People stood near the gates, as if history itself had shifted behind them. Some held phones, some simply watched. The moment felt powerful, because Sandringham had always represented private royal continuity, a place where family tradition lived away from public noise. Now that privacy had cracked, the estate had become the center of a national question. Who had the right to protect the royal past? One broadcaster framed it with a line that spread quickly through every conversation. "This is not about who lives in the house, it is about who is trusted with what the house remembers." Catherine heard those words and lowered her gaze. Camilla heard them and went still. Charles heard them and knew the story had moved beyond control. The king could no longer let silence explain his decision. Silence had created the wound. Silence had fed the speculation. Silence now threatened to turn protection into scandal. Charles prepared to speak to those closest to him, not through a public address, but through a private family explanation recorded in a confidential household note. The king understood that Catherine's quiet dignity had begun to draw public sympathy, while Camilla's pain had become part of the same headline. He had to make clear why he signed the order, why Sandringham mattered, and why the records could not remain vulnerable. And when the king finally spoke, the order stopped being a scandal and became a verdict. In the end, the private order was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of correction. Charles had not signed Catherine into Sandringham's records to humiliate Camilla, weaken the household, or ignite another royal fracture. He signed because the past had become too vulnerable, too disputed, and too important to leave in the wrong hands. The monarchy needed a guardian, and he chose the woman who had earned silence, patience, and trust. Charles gathered the closest family members and made the truth plain without raising his voice. Catherine's role was not decorative. It was not a polite honor placed beside her name to make the order look softer. It was a formal responsibility, meaning a real duty given with authority and expectation to preserve Sandringham's private truth. The king explained that the records did not belong to personal camps, emotional rivalries, or household influence. They belonged to the continuity of the crown, the long line of monarchy that survives only when memory is protected from pressure, pride, and quiet rewriting. Camilla listened without interruption, and that silence marked the change in her. The queen consort was still wounded. She still felt the sting of being left outside the decision. But she finally understood that Charles had not acted only because of her. He had acted because he feared distortion. He feared old instructions being softened, repeated wrongly, or used to serve people who cared more about access than truth. Camilla saw that the boundary was real, and for the first time, she did not fight it. She absorbed it. Catherine remained composed, but her voice softened when she spoke. She said she would protect the records with fairness, not vengeance. That mattered, because everyone in the room knew she had reason to feel the weight of comparison. Catherine could have let the moment become a victory. She could have allowed Camilla's exclusion to define the story. Instead, she chose restraint. The future queen understood that truth loses its power when it is used only to punish. Charles then confirmed the final point, and the room fell silent. Elizabeth's private instructions had to be preserved exactly as they were written. Not adjusted, not explained away, not reshaped by memory or convenience. The late queen's presence seemed to settle over every person there, not as a ghost, but as a standard. The monarch had left words behind, and Charles had decided those words deserved protection stronger than family comfort. William watched Catherine in that moment and understood what had truly changed. The prince saw that her future role had been quietly defined, not only as the woman beside him, but as a keeper of the monarchy's conscience. She had been trusted with memory, and memory was heavier than ceremony. William saw the cost in her face, but he also saw the strength. The verdict was clear. Sandringham's private records became the test of who could be trusted with memory, restraint, and truth. Charles chose Catherine. Camilla accepted the boundary. William saw the future more clearly, and the monarchy emerged bruised but steadier, because one private signature restored order where silence had allowed doubt to grow. There is no unresolved ending here. The order stood. Catherine accepted the burden. Charles defended his choice, and Sandringham's past finally had a guardian strong enough to protect its meaning. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.